Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to keep Series 9 and Week 72 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, last week we looked at letter 213 and that lovely quote, "I am in fact a hobbit in all but size." Today we start letter 214, written to a reader who apparently thought he'd found a contradiction and was going to out-pedant the professor. In his letter, Mr. A.C. Nunn observed that hobbits are said to give presents to other people on their own birthdays. But he also pointed out that Gollum said the One Ring was his birthday present, indicating that his people received presents on their birthday. Ergo, Mr. Nunn proudly concluded, one of the following must be true. 1. Smeagol's people were not of hobbit kind, as suggested by Gandalf. 2. The hobbit custom of giving presents was only a recent growth. 3. The customs of the Stoors, that would be Smeagol's people, differed from those of other hobbits. Or 5, yes, he skipped 4, there is an error in the text. You got me there, Mr. Nunn. In fairness, Professor Tolkien was far kinder. In fact, he wrote a letter in reply so long that it's going to take us 2 weeks to look at it, as he covers the apparent contradiction, the history of hobbit gift-giving, Deagle's alleged gift to Smeagol, the role of matriarchs in hobbit families, and even touches on the whole idea of heads of families in general. So let's get stuck in. Now, Tolkien's first defense is that he's not creating any of this. In the matter of the Third Age, I regard myself as a recorder only. So, any faults are the result of incomplete information or omissions. And Tolkien says, the attempt to introduce information en passant, which means in passing, in the course of narrative, which naturally tended to cut out many things not immediately bearing on the tale. Aragorn's tax policy, for example. Tolkien moves on then to address the low-hanging fruit in Nunn's argument. In the matter of birthday customs and the apparent discrepancies that you note, we can therefore, I think, dismiss your alternatives 1 and 5. You omit 4. Can I just say that Tolkien's observation that Nunn omitted the number 4 on his list is chef's kiss. It is light years better than correcting a post on the internet that misused an apostrophe in your. But it is absolutely wonderfully pedantic. Now, he shoots down the first alternative, the idea that Smeagol's people might not have been of hobbit kind, as suggested by Gandalf. First, Tolkien points out that Gandalf initially said, I guess, but then adds, in more modern language, he would have said, I deduce, referring to matters that had not come under his direct observation, but on which he had formed a conclusion based on study. But he did not, in fact, doubt his conclusion. It is true all the same, he quotes Gandalf. And while he acknowledges that the second option, that hobbit gift-giving is a recent cultural invention, is in fact possible, he takes that theory in a different direction. He points out that the recorder, that would be Tolkien, says that hobbits, not those of the Shire or Shire folk, and therefore, Tolkien argues, it must be supposed that he means that the custom of giving presents was in some form common to all varieties, including Stoors. Then, he not only concedes the third alternative, the idea that Stoor customs differ from other hobbits, but says basically, of course they differ. He says, we might expect even so deep-rooted a custom to be exhibited in rather different ways in different branches. Then he goes into a ton of wonderful detail, and I'm just going to include some of this uninterrupted. With the remigration of the Stoors back to Wilderland in Third Age 1356, all contact between this retrograde group and the ancestors of the Shire folk was broken. More than 1,100 years elapsed before the Deagle-Smeagol incident, circa 2463. At the time of the party in Third Age 3001, when the customs of the Shire folk are cursorily alluded to insofar as they affect the story, the gap of time was nearly 1,650 years. All hobbits were slow to change, but the remigrant Stoors were going back to a wilder and more primitive life of small and dwindling communities, while the Shire folk, in the 1,400 years of their occupation, had developed a more settled and elaborate social life, in which the importance of kinship to their sentiment and customs was assisted by detailed traditions, written and oral. Though I omitted any discourse on this curious but characteristic fact of their behavior, the facts concerning the Shire could be set out in some detail. The Riverside Stoors must, naturally, remain more conjectural. Now, I don't know if Tolkien intended this, but this 3-paragraph breakdown of the Stoors and their history and the whole migration thing feels a bit like, oh, you want to engage in a detailed argument about the lore with the guy who wrote it? Go right ahead. And it's at this point that the letter switches from what feels like a little bit of a counter argument, right? He's taking these arguments into consideration and kind of shooting them down. He turns it into a full-blown history lesson on hobbit gift giving. He explains that among hobbits, birthdays had, as he puts it, considerable social importance. He then explains that the person whose birthday it was would be called a birding, derived from Old English bird, meaning birth. Then in full Appendix F mode, he says they would be called a ribadian in the original Westron, because he's got to go deep. And next he explains the custom itself and how it was regulated by fairly strict etiquette, which also made many instances mere formalities. Quote, with regard to presents, on his birthday, the birding both gave and received presents, but the processes were different in origin, function, and etiquette. The reception was omitted by the narrator since it does not concern the party, but it was in fact the older custom, and therefore the one most formalized. It does concern the Smeagol-Deagle incident, but the narrator, being obliged to reduce this to its most significant elements and to put it into the mouth of Gandalf talking to a hobbit, naturally made no comment on a custom which the hobbit and we should regard as natural in connection with birthdays. In fact, receiving gifts was said to be an ancient ritual related to family. The receiving of gifts by the birding was a commemoration of his formal incorporation into the clan. And interestingly, since it was about inclusion in a clan, the parents of the child didn't give gifts to their kids on their kids' birthdays. Instead, the reputed head of the family was supposed to give something, if only in token. Giving gifts, on the other hand, Tolkien says, was a personal matter not limited to kinship. In fact, it was a way of expressing thanks and a way of recognizing services, benefits, and friendship shown, especially in the past year. Then we read that once hobbits could walk and talk, which was formally on their third birthday, hobbit children gave presents to their parents. These were supposed to be things produced by the giver, that is, found, grown, or made by the birding, beginning in small children with bunches of wild flowers. This may have been the origin of the Thanksgiving presents of wider distribution, and the reason why it remained correct, even in the Shire, for such presents to be things belonging to or produced by the giver. And it also explains why poorer hobbits would often give gifts of produce or things that they'd made. And finally, for today, not for the letter, which we have to continue next week, Tolkien explains that at the time of Bilbo's party, Shire etiquette was that you would not expect to receive gifts from anyone more distantly related than second cousins, and only those within 12 miles. Tolkien even gives us a footnote to this geographical etiquette range, hence the Hobbit expression, a 12-mile cousin, for a person who stickled for the law and recognized no obligations beyond its precise interpretation, one who would give you no present if the distance from his doorstep to yours was not under 12 miles, according to his own measurement. I think we all know a few 12-mile cousins. Now, for now, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week when we learn more about Hobbit gift giving before looking at their matriarch heads of families. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about next series. You can also support the show, get an ad-free feed and a bonus episode every week. And please join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll notice the handle's now at Prancing Pony Pod. That's because we're moving all the episodes of the PPP and Rings of Power wrap-up over here so that you can enjoy them on YouTube as well. Nothing changes on the podcast. And of course, this is the home of my new streaming show, PPP Plays, running Tuesdays and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. Consolidation is the name of the game on social media, too, so follow all the Prancing Pony production shows by following at Prancing Pony Pod on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok, and simply the Prancing Pony Podcast on Facebook. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.